Good morning, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us this evening.
We have some good morning for joining this this webinar. Good morning if you are in our time zone. Good afternoon if you are in Europe. The webinar is, as you can see in the screen here, is part of the series on climate resilient PPPs. Today we're going to focus on the Jamaica case, and then in the next 2 weeks we'll look at the structure of integrating climate risk in PPPs, looking at the toolkit we are launching with this initiative, looking at project structuring first and then financing. The material that we will discuss in these webinars is available in 2 publications, one on Jamaica and one more on a regional basis. The material will be shared after the webinars. And looking at today's agenda, we're going to have some opening remarks from Adriana Lavalle, our Chief of Operations in the office in Jamaica. Then the Development Bank of Jamaica, Ricardo Monroe, will discuss the PPP model in the country. And then we'll kick in with the work with the colleagues from IMG Rebels and 2 partners in the country in looking at climate resilience and project screening at upstream level with PIMSEC, and an example of climate resilience in an infrastructure asset in a port with Christopher Gale of the Kingston Temple. Please raise questions. You can type questions in the portal here. We're going to have 2 sessions of Q&A, but you can type questions as we go in the presentation. Without further ado, Adriana, please get that up. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Leo. Sorry for earlier. As you can see, this is one of the topics that goes deep in my heart. I'm very excited to be here this morning, and I want to thank you all for being here today. We wouldn't be here without the full support and dedication and ideas and work and stamina of very powerful powerhouses, I call them, people that we have here in Jamaica. So I want to say thank you to Denise Arana, Ricardo Monroe, Sharon Craig from the Development Bank of Jamaica, and of course to our colleagues of PIMSEC and the Climate Change Division of the Ministry of Growth, the PPP, NEPA, and UE. There's a lot of people and a lot of brains that were tapped into to make this tool possible. Why are we doing this? Because in Jamaica particularly, because Jamaica, as you know, is prone to natural hazards, to hurricanes, floods, tsunamis, droughts, and being an island coupled with the fragile economy. We're not going to start with a fragile economy that depends on the resources of tourism and few industries make the economy very vulnerable to climate change and susceptible to external financial economic shocks. As you know, the ongoing economic and social challenges as regulation of natural environment, and now with COVID, this is further compounded. So now, because any dollar, any investment that happens in Jamaica has to be done thinking with resiliency in mind. It will be a pity to spend money and to have high investments in areas that will be subject to the degradation and high impact of natural disasters, right? So we're here using a tool to build a better future, to help in the financial recovery on private investment. And this is also an opportunity to align our long-term strategies with sustainable development. Why PPP Jamaica? Because PPP Jamaica has demonstrated its ability to be PPP ready. It's an instrument that is not the first time it's been used before with a lot of success. And there's a reason why Jamaica ranks number 4 in Latin America, not the Caribbean. It's the first in the Caribbean, but it's 4th in Latin America as a whole region. In our latest Infrascope, a ranking of PPP ready countries. Why is it there? Because they have excellent results in their institutional framework, and they have regulatory framework that is supporting of PPP transactions and keeps in mind also the fiscal aspects of it. We believe that PPPs are key in the recovery of the economic development of Jamaica. And this is we need to put the issue of resiliency and achieving the infrastructure that is resilient in the future. So I don't want to get into much speaking because of me, we're a little late. So let's please go ahead, and I'm really looking forward to this event, and most importantly, sharing with all of you this innovative tool that has been developed. Thank you.
Many thanks, Adriana. And I think we'll go with Ricardo, manager of PPPs at DBJ, and one of the real protagonists of this work in this 18 months of project since we started.
So welcome all. I'd like to thank you all for joining us on this journey that we have started maybe a year and a half ago. The work that has been done is a pivotal moment for us because we see where we're improving our PPP program. We're adding a new element, something that, as Adriana said, we can't afford not to do, because Jamaica, like many other countries in the Caribbean region, don't have the luxury of not dealing with the issues surrounding climate change. And we thought that this work was important for the long-term development of our country. So the Development Bank of Jamaica, our mission is to provide opportunities to all Jamaicans to improve their quality of life through development financing, capacity building, public-private partnership, and privatization solutions in keeping with government policy. The PPP unit is jointly run by the DBJ and the Ministry of Finance and Public Service. The DBJ has the responsibility for the day-to-day coordination of the program and management of PPP development, while the Ministry of Finance unit has a responsibility for fiscal management of PPPs. As Adriana said, we are a young program. We started the PPP program in 2012. Right now, as was mentioned, we are ranked 4th in the Latin American Caribbean region. To date, we have over $560 million in PPP investments currently under contract, mainly in the transportation and logistics sectors. And we have a pipeline of about another 600 million in investments, which would be under contract by between this year and 2023. These are projects in the energy, water, sanitation, and health sectors. So this work was important to us for many reasons, but the first one is that we want to create people first PPP projects. So we want to protect our people and maintain high quality infrastructure and services that improve the livelihoods of people through our PPPs. And we couldn't do that without thinking about whether the infrastructure that would be created in these projects would last and stand the test of time and the future stresses that have been forecasted to affect the Caribbean region. We want to protect vulnerable PPP assets from sea level rise and intense weather events. We want to minimize fiscal risks due to force majeure that would be brought about by sustained climate hazards. In this work, I think we have achieved several things, and we have had a very broad-based stakeholder consultation throughout the development of the toolkit and the diagnostic reports that you will all see, and that is good. We have met with the private sector, we have met with many government agencies, and international partners who gave insight into how we can improve our PPP development process by adding the element of climate risk assessments. We have created a framework for a institutionalized collaboration amongst government agencies. One of the things that we found in this study was that there are many government agencies who have different pieces of the puzzle as it relates to climate data, technical capacity in assessment of climate risks, and other expertise which would have been necessary to properly tackle the problems at the various stages of the PPP development process. And we also came to recognize that the government itself doesn't have all the solutions, and that many innovative solutions can be generated by the private sector. So we have developed in the toolkit a mechanism to get the private sector involved and to incentivize them to bring in solutions to PPPs that would see to them being more resilient to climate risks. And ultimately, one of our biggest achievements is that we have a framework that we can use today to update our policy. And we are in the process of updating our PPP policy to include climate risk assessment in our PPP criteria. And we're not doing it alone, and that's a good thing. We're working with our partners, such as the Ministry of Finance, the Public Investment Management Secretariat, who you will hear from shortly, so that we can create an entire ecosystem of project planning that looks at climate risks more seriously. So this is very exciting stuff for us, and we are anxious to share with you through our team from Rebel and IDB what we have learned and what we have come up with. So you'll see that shortly, and we hope that you will continue to give us feedback and contribute. So as Adriana said, we have met with a myriad of stakeholders. This list that is here that you're seeing is not all, but we just have to call out a few. The University of the West Indies Department of Geography and Geology, Donovan Campbell, the Climate Change Division, the team from the ODPEM, the team from the National Environment and Planning Agency, the Planning Institute of Jamaica, the Public Investment Management Secretariat, Kingston Freeport Terminal Limited, Airports Authority, the CDB, of course, the Rebel Group, and the IDB. We could not have done this without the support of Adriana, John Leo, and a wider team who provided technical input and advice on the report and on the toolkit. So we would like to thank all our contributors for bringing us this far. So without further ado, I'd like to hand over to John Leo again, and if anyone wants to contact us, here's our contact details. And of course, well, last but not least, I have to thank the team here from the Development Bank of Jamaica as well. Sharon, Craig, Denise, and the entire team in the P4 unit has been very, very helpful in giving us the push, to do this while we continue to develop projects. So thank you all, and I hope you enjoy the rest of the proceedings.
Thank you, Ricardo, for your great words, and also for taking a bit the courage of venturing with us in this trip. No, I think there are not so many examples around, so I think we really needed a partner like DBJ that wanted to learn what to try, and to test a bit these concepts and think with us on how we can improve it. And as Ricardo said, it's not simple because of the many stakeholders involved. And the fact that tools and things we do in one side, in one phase of the project development in the PPP has to be consistent with what the other stakeholders can do in the rest of the phases. Kind of like it's really a teamwork across institutions, and I think we are impressed by the level of collaboration we found in Jamaica. MG Rebel has been a great technical partner for all this work. So we'll let Elisa, Donadi, and Marcella take us through our assessment for Jamaica, a summary of our policy recommendation, this work, and then responding to questions if there are any. Elisa, please, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Jan Leo. And good morning, everyone. I think, yes, I'm sharing right now. Good morning, everyone. Thank you for being here, for participating. My name is Elisa Donadi. I'm part of Rebel Group, the consulting firm that was part of this wonderful opportunity. I'd like to thank IDB and DBJ for engaging us and be part of this wonderful effort. Okay, so we supported Jamaica in conducting and diagnostics, identifying best practices and development of tools and policy recommendations for this assessment. The diagnostics focus mostly on meetings with stakeholders and reviewing the 16 PPP framework, as well as the review of some of the projects, both from the screening phase to contract management. Some of them include the Caymanas Special Economic Zone, the Kingston Container Terminal, and also big projects like the Norman Manley International Airport. As of the best practices, we had interviews with different stakeholders, insurance companies, public officers, and practitioners. And we did desk research as well. Most of our emerging practices will come from Chile, from the Japan climate resiliency practices at the project level, and to some extent from Canada, as well as some climate resilience tools that are available for practitioners. There are some emerging practices, but there are not so many, as Ricardo was saying, and Jaleo was saying that this is a first of its kind effort. So Jamaica is pioneering in this effort to try to incorporate this climate resiliency measures in the PPP project lifecycle. So also as mentioned by Ricardo, Jamaica has a well-structured and sound PPP framework and also has a very advanced practice. It's a country leader in the region in implementing PPP projects. In our analysis, I just want to go through this quickly so we go directly into the findings, but Jamaica PPP process mirrors that of best practices compared to other jurisdictions. So you go from project identification, business case, procurement or transaction, and then contract management. Our analysis identify opportunities for incorporating climate resiliency in the projects across the project cycle. In the next slide, I will explain a little bit more in detail some of these opportunity areas. So the key main policy recommendations that covers all of the phases of the project cycles are three. The first one encompasses both project identification and business case, and is to assess climate risk for every project and every PPP project. So we distinguish here from high-level screening to detail if required, detail-level screening if required. I also want to emphasize that at the identification and business case, projects don't need to be PPP projects or potential PPP projects in order to have a climate resilience assessment. For the other incorporations of climate resilience measures in the procurement process and the contract management, it's more tailored to the PPP process, but not for the first stage. So our second recommendation is to include resiliency requirements in the transaction phase. That could be requirements in the RFQ, RFP, also output specifications in the contract agreement, as well as evaluation criteria and the way bidders are going to be scored. And last, but not least, in the contract management phase, to re-examine the force majeure definition, making sure to exclude those regular climate events, and also to make sure that they're insured, and to include uninsurability clause in the PPP agreement. So for the rest of the presentation, we're going to provide with our diagnostic for each of these recommendations, how we got into these recommendations, emerging practices, and then more specific policy suggestions for the government of Jamaica to implement. So in the first phase, assessing climate risk for every project or PPP project, we found that during project identification at the policy level, there is no explicit mention of the need of a climate risk assessment during the screening level in the evaluation criteria, nor in the typical documents required in the evaluation criteria at this stage. I do want to clarify that PINSEC has been extremely proactive, and we did this first research in 2019, and we know that as of earlier this year, they started incorporating this kind of measures and the need of climate risk assessment in their policies, in the required documentation at this stage. So the team in PINSEC is probably going to elaborate a little bit later in this webinar about this. So in practice, there is no really guidelines on how to incorporate climate risk assessment at this stage, although it could be considered when there is a material risk. And then at the business case stage, again, at the policy level, there are now clear guidelines on how to incorporate climate risk assessment in the project development. It is assumed in practice, so the perception is that climate risk may be covered in the environmental impact assessment, but it's not always or fully featured in the feasibility studies. One of the examples is Cayman Special Economic Zone that identifies some of the climate risks, but there is no clear mitigation plan. So we also didn't find any particular link of climate risk assessment to other studies during the business case, for example, the value for money assessment or the cost benefit analysis or the financial feasibility per se. So when going into the emerging practices, some common practices that we found is that climate risk assessment, the methodology at the identification level and business case is similar. The only difference is, as with other risk assessment, at the business case stage, it's more in detail. We also found that data is extremely important, especially at the national and regional level. Climate models at national and regional levels can lead to better understanding of the hazards instead of the typical global climate map. So this is why it's so important to liaise with local institutions and universities in order to get the right data. We also found that qualitative assessment of climate risk is always important, whereas quantitative assessment is not always useful or even possible due to data constraints. And last, we also found a myriad of resources and methodologies in knowledge repository that could facilitate and guide policymakers in the preparation of climate risk assessment. There is one of the IDB that has a thorough explanation of different approaches and routes on how to implement climate risk assessment. We're the IDB is going to develop a little bit more of this in other webinars. There's also CCORL, and they offer a variety of options for developing climate risk assessment. So in terms of policy recommendations, it is important to enforce a high-level climate risk assessment for all projects, determine the profile if it's low, medium, or high risk. I am not going to elaborate on the measures. We're going to talk about that in the next webinar, but basically, the recommendation is not to always do a comprehensive climate risk assessment, but rather to understand if the climate risks are medium to high. And then we do recommend at the business case stage for projects with medium to high risk profile to conduct a and develop a detailed climate risk assessment. And then I think the right use for climate risk assessment is to incorporate these findings into other studies. So I think this is key to really do a thorough analysis and try to link climate risk assessment not as a standalone process, but also a process that feeds other studies, such as File for Money, for feasibility analysis, the technical feasibility as well. And last, just to develop a climate risk mitigation strategy. So with that, I will hand over to my colleague Marcel Ham, that he will continue the presentation.
Thank you. And before I'm getting into the next phase, I want to emphasize one thing that Elisa just said. So far, what we've been discussing, the identification stage and the business case stage, they are actually, so the recommendations that we developed there are a bit agnostic as to the selection of delivery model. So whereas our analysis focuses very much on PPP projects, the recommendations apply equally to any infrastructure project, regardless of the delivery model. Now we're getting into the transaction phase and the contract management phase. We get a bit more specific because those recommendations apply very specifically to PPP projects. Another thing I want to emphasize is that all the policy recommendations apply equally to projects that were initiated by the government, as well as projects that were initiated as an unsolicited proposal. So the government of Jamaica allows for unsolicited proposals, and as a sort of rule of thumb, it uses the same exact procedures and the same exact evaluation criteria and analyses for publicly initiated projects and unsolicited proposals. And that also means that our recommendations apply equally to both projects as well. Now getting into the procurement phase. So I would like to go back to the previous slide on the diagnosis. So what we found in Jamaica is at the policy level, there are no standard PPP documents. There are no standard procurement documents or project agreements, and that is not that may sound as criticism, but it's not. There's many jurisdictions that don't have a standard documentation, and it doesn't mean that Jamaica doesn't follow best practices, because it actually does. It's just the fact, the observation is at a policy level, there are no standard documentations, there are no standard guidelines, and that also means that climate risks are not considered explicitly in standard documents or guidelines, because they don't exist. Then in practice, actually climate risk is mentioned and referred to in procurement documentation. So when we zoom into, for example, the Kingston container terminal procurement documentation, it actually mentions risk in general, but also climate risk more specifically. Interesting observation on Kingston containment terminal is that the procurement documentation actually refers to those risks, but does not require anything specific from bidders when it comes to the mitigation of those climate risks. Norman Manley International Airport doesn't mention specifically mention any risks or climate risks. The interesting thing there is that during the business case phase, there had been feasibility studies and also risk assessments in which those climate risks were flagged. So that could have been an opportunity to then carry those analyses forward into the procurement phase. So that brings us to emerging practices. And on the emerging practices, we're actually cheating a little bit because there are no real emerging practices when it comes to specifically climate risk. There are emerging practices or good practices when focusing on how to protect the public interest or how to achieve public objectives. And so there's generally two ways that procuring agencies try to use to further their public objectives. One is in a prescriptive way, which is including mandatory minimum requirements. So typically in PPP procurements, there's big volumes of technical specifications, and one way, if we apply this process to climate risk, then one approach to dealing with climate risk in procurement documentation would be to prescribe exactly how bidders should deal with climate risk mitigation. So that's one angle. The other angle is also very common in the PPP space. Is through evaluation criteria. So rather than being prescriptive and spelling out how exactly bidders need to deal with it, procuring agencies can also invite and encourage bidders to come up with their own climate risk mitigation plans. That can then be submitted and considered in the evaluation of PPP bids. That process, so the first approach, the prescriptive approach, makes sense where there's only one way to deal with a certain climate risk, or transaction costs of bidders figuring out their own ways of dealing with climate risk would be prohibitive. When, however, procuring agencies are expecting some interesting ideas from bidders when it comes to climate risk mitigation, it could make sense to go to the second approach and to invite bidders to come up with their risk mitigation plans, but also more specifically climate risk mitigation plans. And then it would obviously also make sense to consider those plans in the evaluation of the proposals by incorporating the extent to which bidders are expected to be effective in climate risk mitigation in the evaluation criteria. Moving into policy recommendations, so specifically for Jamaica, we and actually this applies to many procuring agencies, we recommend to consider climate risk considerations, to include climate risk considerations in all the procurement documents, starting with the RFQ. So in some cases, not all, but in some cases, it makes sense to include climate risk mitigation capabilities in an RFQ. So RFQ process where typically there's a short listing of qualified bidders, and one of the criteria to determine if bidders are qualified could be the extent to which bidders are capable of mitigating climate risk, especially if that is a big issue in a project. The second element would be technical specifications, as we just discussed. The third element would be in the RFP, the request for proposals to include climate resilience in the evaluation criteria, and therefore also in the submission requirements, asking bidders to provide certain plans as part of their technical proposals, and eventually all incorporated in the project agreement. Because whatever is going to be included in technical specifications, whatever is going to be developed by bidders needs to eventually be enforced through the project agreement. So therefore, it makes sense to include those elements in the project agreement, link them to a payment mechanism, and to make sure that we actually enforce what was developed during those earlier stages. Another recommendation is to let bidders either during the procurement or after contract award develop disaster response plans to the extent that those cannot be prescribed by the agency. Another policy recommendation is on the funding and financing side to consider some specific climate resilient funding and financing options. And we'll dive deeper into what those options are and when they apply in the next webinars. Moving on to the next phase, which is the contract management phase. Again, we're starting with the diagnosis of what we found when we looked at policy and practice in Jamaica. And here too, there was initially no explicit mention of climate risk at a policy level. And again, this is not criticism. This is just something that we're seeing in most jurisdictions. In practice, we have seen in project agreements a reference to extreme weather events or climate risks in the definition of force majeure. For example, in the Kingston Container Terminal, the force majeure definition explicitly refers to natural disasters. That is a generic reference. It does not specifically consider any like local climate risks that are very specific to the project. So that could have been an option, or can be an option for a next project. On insurance and uninsurability, some projects do include clear insurance requirements. So bidders would have to meet certain insurance requirements. We have not found any ways of dealing with uninsurability. And what we mean with that is, what happens if over time certain risks, climate-related risks, would become uninsurable? And the PPP agreement would have to somehow be able to deal with that. And so we've seen examples elsewhere where uninsurability is incorporated, and procedures to deal with uninsurability are incorporated in the agreement. We haven't found such examples in Jamaica. But that leads us to the emerging practices. On the force majeure side, we are seeing two general approaches in defining force majeure. One approach is a very open-ended definition of force majeure, and again, we're going to go in more detail in next webinars. Another approach is like to include a list of specific events that qualify as force majeure. The interesting thing here is when you try to carry the climate risk assessment that we did in the earlier stages of the project into developing the PPP agreement, we may want to include or exclude certain climate risks. So if climate risks become very common in a certain area, then maybe a blanket statement about natural disasters being qualifying as a force majeure event wouldn't be the best solution. Maybe we want to carve out such very common events from the definition of force majeure, because force majeure would lead to excusing both the bidder and also the government from its obligations under the agreement. So and we are actually seeing those emerging practices as well. So some common events being excluded from force majeure. On the uninsurability side, what we are seeing is in some PPP agreements across the globe, there are specific clauses dealing with uninsurability, meaning what happens if over time, so initially when the contract was awarded, some risks were insurable, but then over time they become uninsurable, meaning that a bidder cannot deal with those risks anymore. And then there's specific procedures that deal with such events. We'll go into more detail on how that works in the next webinar. So that brings us to policy recommendations for this last phase. They mainly are to incorporate insurance requirements in the project agreement, to consider incorporating a simplified change regime for future changes associated with climate change. So we know that many project agreements have a detailed process for dealing with changes. What we are recommending is to say, what if some changes are necessary or very useful in order to deal with climate risk? Maybe we don't want to go through a very cumbersome process, make it very hard for bidders to improve climate resilience. Maybe we need a simplified change regime if it actually helps to improve climate resilience. Finally, customization of the force majeure definition, as we just discussed. When we find in the early stages of a project that certain risks are very common, that may mean something for the definition of force majeure in the project agreement. And finally, the uninsurability, as just discussed. Something may be insurable today, it may not be insurable in 10 years from now. PPP agreements are long-term agreements, so we need to think about how to address such circumstances. So with this, we have discussed the main policy recommendations for all the phases in the PPP project lifecycle. And in the next webinars, we'll dive deeper and provide the practical tools on how to do this in practice. And with that, I'm turning it over to Jean-Léon. Thank you.
Thank you, Marcel and Elisa. I hope you also how detailed this work needs to be in order for climate risk and resiliency to be considered in the process. I think I just want to highlight and emphasize that the next two webinars will kind of like unpack what we've seen in a very, let's say, bird's eye overview from Marcel and Elisa. We'll unpack what we could do at each level of each stage of the project cycle. In the toolkit that will be open for consultation, so we are really looking for inputs and support from the broader community. What we can offer as decision support tools for practitioners, for the public side, for the private side, both on developing the instruments, developing the contracts, and then bidding for the project and promoting resiliency. We are running a bit tight on the time, so I would invite you to put questions in the platform, and we'll have, if we have time, a 10 minutes session at the very end. The next speaker is Albert Daly, Pre-Investment and Evaluation Fund Administrator at PIMSEC in the Ministry of Finance. I think the role of PIMSEC is quite crucial, because when we start talking with DBJ, that was the counterpart at the beginning of the project for the PPP, we quickly realized that a lot of what was being discussed in terms of solution was going upstream, as there are no good reasons sometimes to treat differently a PPP project from a public investment project. And many of the efforts actually were already being done at the very initial identification of projects, and a lot of that information would be useful in the PPP cycle. So that's why I think we've been learning more and more of what PIMSEC has been doing in Jamaica, and hope, and we can see the presentation already. So Albert, the floor is yours. Albert?
Yes, good morning. Are you hearing me?
Yes, now we can hear you. Please, the floor is yours.
Okay, thank you. So, good morning all, or good afternoon, depending on the part of the world you are. And I am from the PIMSEC, and I would like to share a little bit about the progress in practice of integrating climate resilience in project screening, in the project screening process. Just to help those who are not familiar with our arrangements in Jamaica, I'll just say a little bit about what we call the Public Investment Management System, which is a common framework for the preparation, appraisal, and approval and management of all public investments, irrespective of the source of funding or the procurement and implementation modalities. So it's an established system, and the Public Investment Management Secretariat, that is PIMSEC, is that entity given the responsibility to review and appraise public investments and provide support for the Public Investment Management Committee, which is that committee with the responsibility for making decisions on project concepts and project proposals submitted for consideration. I must add that both the function of the PIMSEC as well as the PIMS process is enshrined in law, and so these are addressed in the Financial Administration and Audit Act. Just want to highlight that the PIMS, the PIMSEC or the PIMS process is that central point from which all public investment projects must enter the process. In other words, if a project is to be considered for inclusion in the public investment program of the country, it has to go through the PIMS process, Public Investment Management System. And that entry point begins at the PIMSEC. I just want to also indicate that we cover primarily public investment projects, and these include are classified as non-recurrent public expenditure, and it also includes PPPs as well as regular government investments. And these projects, these investments should be aimed at accumulating new physical or intangible assets for the country in order to advance development objectives. Just to say a little bit about the process, we have a two-stage process in deciding on projects. It begins with the concept phase, when the concept is documented by the respective ministry, department, or agency, and is submitted. Now, the PIMSEC provides a template, a format, which we require the various organizations to complete and submit to us. It is appraised by the Secretariat and then forwarded to what we call a technical review committee made up of technical experts from various arms of the public sector, including the Planning Institute of Jamaica, including as well the National Environmental and Planning Agency, JAMPRO, and other critical government entities. Once it is reviewed by this technical review committee, it's then forwarded to the Public Investment Management Committee, which is chaired by the Minister of Finance, and it is that committee that makes a decision on the project concept. If it is approved, it is then passed on to the agency to be developed as a full proposal. And so the process then is continued with either project proposal being developed, if it's the case of a regular investment or business case, in the case of a PPP. There's also a project proposal template, which is expected to be completed by the various entities submitting proposals. And once submitted, they will be appraised by the Secretariat and then forwarded to the Technical Review Committee to again give their feedback on the project and give guidance as to any suggested change or anything that they think should be considered if the project is to be improved or considered for approval. Then it is submitted to the Public Investment Management Committee, and a decision is made by that committee. If approved, it is then moved on to the cabinet level, where final decision will be made. So we have two steps in the process: the concept phase from step 1 to step 4, and the proposal or business case phase, which is step 1 to step 5. In terms of the approach to appraisal of these projects, what we do, because right now what we have is a sort of initial step towards the formalizing of the consideration of climate change impacts. It was just last December that we adjusted our templates to include requirements for climate change considerations. However, these templates had in past included a risk assessment section, which would require the proposals to address risk-related matters, which would include climate change. But certainly, among the things we do ask for is information, especially at the proposal stage, on the impacts of the project on the environment and the nature of the impact, the extent of the impact, the magnitude and complexity of the impact, probability of the impact occurring, and the steps proposed for the addressing of these environmental impacts and the associated costs to reduce or offset the significant adverse impacts. So at the environmental impact level, we look at a number of issues which should also feature very often in the aspect or in the climate change aspect of the appraisal. So in terms of what we do now, in including climate change considerations, what we have done since last year is to ask of our project proposers to provide information on the current and projected impacts of climate change as they see on their projects and the project environment. We do have in Jamaica what we call a State of the Climate report produced by the Planning Institute with the support of the University of West Indies. And that report, among other things, will provide information on the anticipated change in climate over the years to come, as well as how various locations, sections of the island will be impacted and how various sectors will be impacted by climate change. That publication is readily available. And so we ask agencies now submitting proposals to collect data or review that document and any other document available to them to get some sort of indication as the current and anticipated impacts of climate change, the likelihood of it occurring, and the damages that maybe can be expected. But most certainly, we expect that all proposals would indicate recommended actions to promote climate resilience and reduce the negative impacts, as well as the associated costs of those proposed initiatives. Now, we realize that many of the entities may not have experts within their organizations who would be able to readily provide the information that they need, but and that is one of the reasons why part of the proposal we have for the future is for more capacity development. But there are entities, especially those that are dealing with infrastructure projects, that do have persons on board or have access to persons or can afford to contract persons to help in the actual assessment of the climate impacts, and therefore the inclusion of such information in the project proposal. So once the project proposal comes to us, and especially at the concept stage, there is no clear requirement for data at that level. But basically, what we look at in the appraisal process is whether the project qualifies as a national or strategic project of national importance, given our long-term national development plan, our medium-term development plan, as well as the organizational corporate plan or other priorities of the government for which that agency may have responsibility. So we do ask at the concept level that that information be provided. But what we do expect is some indication of the technical approach to the project, which would somehow, very often, give an indication of some of the challenges that may have to be looked at. What we are now doing, especially after a recent training that we had on the use of the sea coral, which is a Caribbean climate online risk and adaptation tool, we are now beginning to use this tool to get a high-level assessment as to whether the project under consideration is at a high risk level or a medium level risk or low level risk with respect to the impacts of climate change. And that will give some indication to our appraisers internally as to what sort of approach probably should be taken towards this project if it is to go forward, and to help to ask some critical questions about the approach to the project. But at the concept stage, there is not such a great emphasis on providing hazard risk assessment and that sort of thing. But essentially, what we do try to get is some sense as to how the project could be impacted by climate change, with the view that if this concept is approved, then at the proposal stage, greater consideration will be given to that particular area to make sure that it is addressed in the proposal. At the appraisal of the project proposal, it is at that level that we pay a lot of attention to climate risk assessments, as well as the strategies to address these risks. Our analysts are careful to look at aspects of the proposal, like the proposed location of the project. Is it located in, is it proposed to be located in a high-risk area in terms of, is it in a coastal area? Is it in an area that is likely to be flooded with sea level rise? Is it in a flood-prone area? And so on. So we look at those technical aspects of the project and try to ascertain whether, from the information submitted, whether this project is one that is going to be significantly impacted by climate change. And we do refer to the State of the Climate Report, which also helps to point to locations, areas that will be significantly impacted, and therefore if projects are to be located in those locations, then we'll have a good sense that that's an area for serious consideration in terms of how the project is finally designed. In addition to all of that, we look at the socioeconomic feasibility aspect, which would, among other things, look at whether the project is economically feasible if we take into consideration all the likely economic and other costs associated with the project. So would the project be feasible if it is required to adopt a technical standard, a technical specification, which will allow it to be more resilient? And so there is a great emphasis on our part at the Secretariat to help the proposing entities to look closely at that area. And if we have an issue in the aspect of whether or not all the critical costs are considered, then there'll be dialogue with the entity to ensure that that aspect is addressed before we finalize our appraisal of the project. So in terms of the appraisal then, we basically look at the standard areas and the standard aspect of the project for appraisal, the technical, the financial, the socioeconomic, but we look more closely at how the project may be impacted and whether climate resilient strategies are being incorporated in the project to ensure that the level or to minimize the level of risk to which the project is exposed to. And of course, this approach is taken whether the project is a regular public investment project or whether it is a PPP project or any other type of public investment. In terms of the goals for the future, how we see ourselves moving forward, we definitely think that there is a need to encourage proposers, that's ministries, departments, and agencies, to do the type of information collecting in relation to their investment that will allow them to have a good appreciation of the climate hazards to which their project are likely to be exposed. We intend to ask of them to provide information on the likelihood of some of these hazards occurring, of course, at the high level, and then to look at the likelihood that the project will be significantly damaged by these events, and to make some sort of high level or overall assessment of the climate hazard that the project is likely to be significantly impacted by. So we see the tools being developed now for PPP as being something that we could adopt to use at the PIMSEC in our appraisal, in addition to the C-Crawl, which is another tool that is available to us, because there are some features of the proposed tool which we find, which appear to be very, very useful and would indeed complement the C-Crawl tool that we are thinking also of using in our appraisal. So that's one key area that we want to look at in the future, the concept phase, and ensuring that some consideration is given at the early stage as to how the project will be impacted by climate change and by the risk associated with that. At the project proposal stage, also we are also planning to even further upgrade the data requirements or information requirement we now have for the project proposal guidelines that we prepare, so that we encourage the MDAs to include the type of information that will help not only us at the PIMSEC to assess the project, but also the agencies proposing the project to get a good sense as to whether the project that they're seeking to propose is one which is climate resilient. So the type of information we'll be seeking from them is the type of information that will help to get more in-depth assessment on the hazards, a closer look at the damage that could occur if these hazards are realized, a closer look at the adaptation options that may be considered, and a closer look at the adaptation or mitigation option that may be most appropriate, and to look also at the costs associated with implementing the preferred adaptation option. So we're looking really at drawing from the tool to help our entities or MDAs, ministries, departments, and agencies to pay closer attention to the type of information that would help to ensure that we are better equipped to design more resilient projects. And then finally, in terms of capacity, in terms of the future, we see a need for capacity development at the PIMSEC so that our own staff will be more fully prepared to analyze the projects, to recognize the range of impacts that may be created or that may arise from the various hazards, and the adaptation and mitigation strategies that may be appropriate for various types of projects in various sectors to promote resilience, so that we'll be more equipped to effectively assess proposals and to determine if options proposed may be the most appropriate for the proposed project. And of course, the MDAs would need capacity development, I would think, as well. And so we would definitely want to encourage and support whatever initiatives may be in place to strengthen their own capacity to address those concerns. So in a nutshell, the PIMSEC is really very keen on ensuring that the projects that we submit for approval and for inclusion in our public investment program are projects that are climate resilient. And since all investment projects have to pass through the PIMSEC, we see ourselves at a very pivotal point in the process to ensure that the projects that are submitted and designed are projects which include climate resilient strategies and approaches, so that sustainability in the long run will be much more realizable. So that's about it for me.
Many thanks, Albert. Really interesting to see how far you are in terms of the upstream assessment. And now, I mean, to make it tangible how the issue needs to be taken as much upstream as downstream, we go and we move all the other end of the spectrum with an operator of an asset, Christopher Gale, environmental specialist at the Kingston Freeport Terminal. Christopher, please, the floor is yours.
Okay, thank you.
We will be able to see your presentation in a second.
Are you seeing?
Perfect. Yes, I think we see perfect, and we see you and hear you perfectly. Thank you.
Okay, I want to sort of broaden the discussion slightly to include the disaster risk as well, because we have considered those risks, while operating the port so far. KFTL, is basically it's a consortium headed by CMA CGM to operate the Kingston Container Terminal under a 30-year concession. The project is financed by IDB Invest and some other lenders. And whilst, as mentioned by earlier, alluded to earlier, the issue of climate risk wasn't explicitly stated in the due diligence and project documents. However, we've had to contend with the real impact of these risks on the ground during operation so far. So in terms of asset exposure, we have over 2,000 meters of berth and over 16 gantry cranes. If you look at the criticality of the port, and it's important to Jamaica and Jamaica's economy, the port is located almost dead center, 32 miles off the north-south sea lanes between North and South America, South America and Europe, and also linking with Asia. So it's pivotally located. Now, in addition to that, it intersects with the hurricane belt. If you were to superimpose a hurricane track map, you would see that there would be a lot of intersection as it relates to the location of KFTL and, by extension, Jamaica. Right. In addition to that, as it relates to the climate scenarios that have been generated, again, Jamaica, is smack in the center for increased heat impact in the future. And so therefore, even we still, as a company, need to take the issues of climate risk into consideration in our operations. Now, for further context, KFTL, KCT is ranked 8th in Latin America and the Caribbean in terms of throughput, having done 1.8 million 20-foot equivalent units in 2018. Now, KFTL as a group, as I mentioned earlier, it's headed by CMA CGM, and at the group level and on by extension the local level, we have identified 10 critical risks, of which natural disasters, fires, pollution, are among them. So if you look at the climate risk specific to the port, we talk about sea level rise, extreme heat, which expose our assets, lead to occupational health impact towards our team members. If you look at intense storms, flooding is a possible impact, as also lightning strikes, reduced visibility, which impacts our operation. The issue of high winds as well. We have experienced these things since operation, and at times these things have led to a suspension in operations. As it relates to the natural hazard risk, these are mentioned earlier: earthquakes, hurricanes, and if you look at the wider disaster risk, more recently public health emergencies of international concerns, and I'll speak briefly about that as they go on. And of course, accidents and loss of life, injury to staff. Now, if you talk about climate risk, I think if we look at the single risk that has impacted us from the start of operations, last year, the CARICOF heat outlook called for 45% chance of above normal temperatures in Jamaica, and that scenario actually played out with the hottest day on record being recorded on June 22 last year, previously before that, the record was 2017. If you take into account that 800 of our 1100 plus staff work on the outside, on a 24-hour basis, then the occupational health impact is critical and poses a risk to our operations. So we had a real impact last year, as staff reported heat-related stress and fatigue, and we had some minor reduction in productivity. In terms of response, we had to give more frequent breaks to the team on the ground. We had to increase hydration, and we increased medical surveillance for at-risk staff with pre-existing conditions. And of course, in terms of comfort, we maintained a KPI in terms of the air conditioning functionality in our equipment of 90%. And also, if you look at those two pictures, we had what we call, we initiated what we call a Beat the Heat series, where on a Friday we'd bring in some sort of hydration and refreshment for the staff while they're on their break. If you look at the more recent discussion, or the topic of discussion now, COVID, right? And while COVID is not quite considered a climate risk, it is a disaster risk. Luckily, KFTL, it wasn't a blind spot totally for us, as KFTL is the designated seaport under the international health regulations, and those are regulations adopted by countries to deal with public health emergencies of international concerns. And so we got out the gate very early, recognizing that KFTL is a critical asset, an essential asset that needed to remain open over the period. And so we established a impact dashboard where we tracked impact to the terminal as it relates to staff affected by department, and affected meaning whether or not they were diagnosed or suspected or in state or KFTL imposed quarantine. Luckily for us, we are now down to 0 on both those counts. Nobody was impacted, notwithstanding a 24-hour operation, notwithstanding 1,000 employees and so on. If we go into briefly some of the measures that we took, we had our non-essential workers, rotating or working from home, and then we implemented an environmental cleaning regime, also infection prevention protocol, temperature checks, increased hand sanitization, social distancing, cleaning of our shuttle buses every other trip. And so far, these measures have served us well. We are now into the transition phase, in keeping with the directions of the government in terms of back to work. And so we have made the necessary adjustments to allow all our employees, to continue along that vein. Now, it was mentioned earlier that seismic risk was considered in the development or in the project documents for KFTL and the due diligence. And so one of the major projects of, since taking over, refurbishment of 1,200 meters of the south terminal, it was designed for a 475-year return period, with a seismic acceleration of 0.2 Gs. So the south terminal right now is extremely resilient to earthquake risk, if you look at that. All right, as it relates to upgrade of our stormwater drainage infrastructure, ports by their very nature, in a lot of cases are, vulnerable to flooding. And so we had one, around our maintenance yard where our critical assets exist. We upgraded our stormwater drainage network, but we considered it was upgraded based on hydrologic assessment, which took into account weather-related and climate data. All right, and so we're confident that the newly upgraded infrastructure has mitigated that risk. In terms of next steps, even though KFTL is not required fundamentally to, under the project to implement climate change adaptation measures, we, as a part of our operations and recognizing, our impact and potential impact so far, we will continue to assess climate change and disaster risk and integrate adaptation measures, in particular those incidents with low probability and high consequence. And so we see the promulgation of this tool as very timely. Even though we're a brownfield development, we intend to have a look at it and see how best we can use it to improve our adaptation going forward. That is the end of the presentation. Thanks.
Many thanks, Christopher. And we have a few minutes only for questions. So I think we have one question for Albert and from a colleague at the IDB, from Sergio Lacambra. Albert, the question is whether the information on climate change impacts you require from MDAs is a voluntary optional practice or is actually a legal mandate from PIMSEC to the MDAs, as in terms of governance, the implication would be quite different. And while you respond, I think we have a question also for Christopher. Given that KFTL is not required by the documents to implement all those changes, what are the drivers for KFTL in investing in resiliency practices, and whether, let's say, resiliency requirements in the tender document would actually, from your perspective, make it better for you as you would level the playing field with the other potential bidders? Albert, first with you. Please unmute yourself. Thank you. Albert, I think you're still muted.
Okay.
Now, yes, thank you.
Yes. With respect to our templates, I don't know that I would say it is legally binding, but we certainly have the elements that we want to be included in the proposal as outlined there, and we expect that entities where that type of information is available, we expect them to provide it. Because we want to be in a position to present as fulsome a set of information to our decision makers as possible. So we at PIMSEC do have an obligation to help to provide the type of information that will help our decision makers to make decisions that are appropriate with respect to projects. And so we very often encourage our proposal developers to submit same. So I wouldn't say it's a legal requirement, but we do strongly encourage entities to provide the type of information that will help that entity itself to be better equipped to assess their own project, but also to help us to be able to assess and present the type of proposal that will be in the best interest of the country and the people of Jamaica as a whole.
Thank you, Albert. Christopher, over to you.
All right, so in terms of the drivers, a lot of the drivers are internal both to KFTL as also, it's corporate requirements. In addition to that, though, the lender due diligence program, I must say, we work together. It assists in providing solutions and holding us accountable. But at the same time, the business imperative we have recognized, like I said, in practical terms, that this issue needs to be addressed based on the impact to date and impact that we foresee to come if we take the science into account. And so I would say those are the main drivers. And the toolkit, could you repeat the question about the toolkit?
I mean, I'll give you some context on the questions. One reason we see many times developers are concerned about resiliency inclusion is that they will sometimes there are no incentives in the tender documents, because if you tender on lowest price, there is no incentive for increasing the cost of the infrastructure, even if the long-term values and profitability would improve. So we've been, let's say, the common reaction is for those incentives to be in the requirements, no? But in your case, you're actually doing it anyway. So let's say how, and in our, let's say, support to DBJ or other PPP units from the private sector, usually the ones that commission the project, what would be your perspective on including some of those requirements in the tenders, making them, let's say, more compulsory to all the bidders and not left to the private initiative of a single proponent, let's say?
No, absolutely, I agree. I mean, it's always, I mean, you don't want to be forced, but it's good, especially when you consider that in some cases these assets are being operated to be handed over, you know, back to the government at the end of the period. I think that it's the way to go, you know, including it at the outset.
Thank you. I don't see other questions, and we are really right spot on time. So let me just thank you guys a lot for accepting our invitation to these webinars and for your great contribution to the project. Let me thank also the partners on this project, again, DBJ and MG Rebel, and the wider team at IDB. I didn't say it at the beginning, but this is an effort that has been, let's say, led by the Climate Change Division where I'm sitting, but it really goes and finds collaborations across the group with the PPP unit that will be actually presented in the next webinar, with IDB Invest, who's an investor in the project, and Kingston Freeport, who is one of these examples, and also the other colleagues from the Natural Resources the division, doing a lot of the climate stress testing and climate impacts analysis. So let me thank everybody who's been involved and will be involved, and I'll give you the appointment to June 10 for the second webinar on focus on the toolkit. So we move from the Jamaica context to a more regional approach and focus on methodologies. In the first webinar of this on toolkit, we will be focusing on the role of the PP unit, especially in project identification and structuring. Ricardo, I see you turn on your camera, so I'll actually ask you to close impromptu if you want. You are on mute, Ricardo.
I just want to say thanks to the participants, Albert, Christopher. Thank you for moderating. It has been a very informative, hour and a half, and I hope that the other participants, the attendees, find this series very useful, and we look forward to seeing the group again in the second and final webinar to come.
Thank you, Ricardo. The presentations, the recording will be available at the same link where you register on the platform Green Finance Slack. And thank you also to the colleagues to join and colleagues for supporting us with the logistics. I think everything worked fine. Nothing left to say. Thank you very much, and see you for the next webinar. Thank you.
You too.
Thank you.